They were counting the wrong things. While American forces in Vietnam tallied corpses like a supermarket manager counting inventory, while Pentagon analysts turned warfare into spreadsheets, while body count numbers climbed into the tens of thousands, and the war kept getting worse. A 34-year-old Australian major stood in a briefing room in Saigon and said 5 words that made a 2-star general's face go purple. "We don't count bodies." The general, a Pentagon careerman who'd never spent a night in the jungle, demanded clarification. Surely the major meant they counted bodies differently, used a different methodology, had a more accurate system. The Australian looked at him like he'd asked why water was wet. "No, sir, we don't count them at all." The silence in that room lasted 8 seconds. Then the shouting began. This was August 1969. The war had been going for years. 58,000 Americans would eventually die there. The body count obsession had become the defining metric of American strategy. The single number that generals used to prove they were winning, that politicians used to justify the war, that became so important that field units started inflating their numbers, counting civilians, counting the same bodies twice, turning warfare into a sick accounting game where higher numbers meant promotions and lower numbers meant failure. And into this madness had walked 8,000 Australians who treated the body count like it was a joke. Not because they weren't killing the enemy. They were killing the enemy at ratios that made the Pentagon statisticians check their math 3 times. But because they understood something the Americans had forgotten in their obsession with metrics, you don't win guerrilla wars by counting dead farmers. You win by making the enemy irrelevant. The Australian task force in Phuoc Tuy Province wasn't just fighting a different war than the Americans. They were fighting a different kind of war. Same jungle, same enemy, same weapons mostly, but the philosophy, the tactics, the entire approach, it might as well have been a different planet. This is the story of that difference. The story of what happens when you stop measuring success by how many people you kill and start measuring it by whether the enemy can still function. The story of farmhands from Queensland and mechanics from Melbourne who became so effective at counter-insurgency that the North Vietnamese offered bounties on their heads 5 times higher than for American officers. The story of a tactical philosophy so successful that it embarrassed the world's most powerful military, and a major who was willing to say it out loud. Stay with me. This gets uncomfortable. Vietnam in 1969 was a war being lost in metrics. The American command had convinced itself that body counts told the story. Kill more enemy than you lose, maintain a favorable exchange ratio, and eventually you grind them down. It was industrial warfare logic applied to guerrilla conflict. It was First World War mathematics transplanted to a jungle where nothing made sense. McNamara's Pentagon loved numbers. They could graph body counts. They could show trends. They could prove to Congress that progress was being made. Look, we killed 40,000 this month. We're winning. Except they weren't. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army kept coming. Villages that were pacified on Monday were hostile again by Friday. Enormous sweep operations that generated massive body counts changed nothing strategically. The Americans would roll through an area with overwhelming firepower, count the dead, declare victory, and leave. 2 weeks later, the enemy was back like they'd never left. The Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 with 4,500 men, a single province. They weren't trying to win the whole war, just make one province genuinely secure. One province, where the enemy couldn't operate freely, couldn't tax the villages, couldn't recruit, couldn't move supplies. The Americans thought this was adorably modest, quaint even. The Australians were allies, sure, but they were small time. They'd handle their little province, and the grown-ups would fight the real war. 3 years later, Phuoc Tuy Province was the most secure province in 3 Corps. Not secure in the American sense. Big sweeps that looked good on paper. Actually secure. The enemy infrastructure dismantled. The supply routes cut. The political cadres eliminated or fled. Villages that stayed pacified because the VC couldn't get back in. And the Australians had done it with kill ratios that made the numbers look like typos. First Australian Task Force lost 521 killed in action during their entire deployment. They inflicted an estimated 30,000 enemy casualties. That's a kill ratio of roughly 58 to 1. Some operations went higher, 100 to 1, 150 to 1. The Battle of Long Tan in 1966. 18 Australians killed. Enemy losses estimated between 500 to 500, depending on the source. But here's the thing the Pentagon couldn't grasp. The Australians didn't care about those numbers. They cared about whether the enemy could still function. Major Harry Smith wasn't supposed to be the one to say it. The briefing was routine. Australian liaison officers attended American command briefings weekly. Coordination, intelligence sharing, the usual inter-allied bureaucracy. Smith was there because his CO was dealing with a crisis back at Nui Dat, and someone had to represent the task force. Smith had joined the Australian Army in 1952. He'd served in Korea. He'd spent the late 50s training in jungle warfare. By 1969, he was a veteran of 3 years in Vietnam, a company commander who'd led patrols deep into VC-controlled territory, a man who understood what worked and what didn't. He was also blunt to the point of career damage. The briefing covered the previous week's operations. An American division had conducted a major sweep through Binh Duong province. The numbers were impressive. 432 enemy killed, dozens of weapons captured, significant bunker complexes destroyed. The briefing officer presented this as a clear success. Then came the question period. A colonel asked about follow-up operations. What was the plan for maintaining pressure? The briefing officer looked confused. Sir, we're already redeploying to the next AO. The operation achieved its objectives. Smith, sitting in the back row, made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cough, just a sound. The two-star general running the briefing looked up. You have something to contribute, Major. Australian junior officers did not normally contradict American generals. Not in formal briefings, not in front of a room full of field-grade officers. Smith knew this. He weighed it for maybe 2 seconds. What were the objectives, sir? The general's eyes narrowed. Attrition of enemy forces, as stated. And the province after you left. I'm sorry? The province, sir. After your forces redeployed. Who controls it? The room had gone quiet. You could hear the air conditioning. The general's voice dropped to that dangerous register that career officers recognize instantly. We killed 432 enemy combatants, Major. I'd say we control it. For how long? Now the general was angry. What exactly are you implying? Smith stood up. Not aggressive, just the basic courtesy of addressing a senior officer from a position of attention. His voice stayed level, almost friendly. I'm asking, sir, how you measure success. Because if those 432 enemy are replaced next week, and the province looks exactly like it did before the operation, then what did you achieve? You got a big number, but did you win anything? The general's face was doing interesting color changes. We maintain operational pressure through continuous body counts, Smith said. You count bodies. We've read your after-action reports. It's the primary metric. How many did we kill? It's a valid measure of attrition. Is it, though? That was the moment. That was when Smith crossed the line from impertinent to insubordinate. You didn't interrupt a general. You definitely didn't question their strategic framework in front of their staff. Smith did it anyway. Sir, with respect, the Australian task force doesn't count bodies. We never have. We measure completely different things. The general leaned forward. Such as? Can the enemy still operate? Can they still tax villages? Can they still move supplies? Can they still recruit? Can they still execute political control? Smith ticked them off on his fingers. We don't care how many we kill, unless killing them changes those things. And most of the time it doesn't. A lieutenant colonel tried to salvage the situation. Major, the body count is a measurement of nothing that matters, Smith said flatly. You can kill 1,000 VC, and if their infrastructure is still intact, you've accomplished exactly nothing. They'll replace the dead in a month. But if you kill 20 of the right people, the political officers, the logistics specialists, the local commanders, and destroy the supply caches and interdict the trails and make the villages genuinely hostile to enemy presence, then you've won something real. The general's voice was ice. And you've achieved this? In your province? Yes, sir. With what? A fraction of our forces. We've made Phuoc Tuy the most secure province in your core area, not by killing the most people, by making enemy operations impossible. The room erupted. To understand why Smith's words detonated like a claymore, you need to understand what the Americans had invested in body counts. It wasn't just a metric, it was the entire justification for the war's conduct. Politicians needed proof that American deaths meant something. Generals needed proof that their strategies worked. Field commanders needed proof that their operations achieved results. And in a guerrilla war where there were no front lines to advance, no cities to capture, no territorial gains to measure, the body count became everything. It became promotions. It became funding. It became the difference between a successful operation and a failed one, which meant it became corrupted immediately. Units started inflating numbers. If you found 3 dead VC, you reported 5. If you called in artillery on a suspected position and heard secondary explosions, you estimated 20 killed. If you swept through a village after a firefight and found 6 civilian bodies, well, they were probably VC sympathizers anyway. Count them. The corruption wasn't malicious. It was structural. The system demanded numbers, so numbers appeared. Commanders who reported low body counts got questioned. Commanders who reported high numbers got medals. Meanwhile, the war got worse. The Australians had watched this unfold with something between bafflement and disgust. They'd come to Vietnam with a completely different framework. British Commonwealth Counter-Insurgency Doctrine developed in Malaya, Kenya, and Borneo. Lessons learned from fighting communist insurgencies in actual jungles against actual guerrilla forces who actually knew what they were doing. The Malayan emergency had taught them, you don't win by killing insurgents faster than they recruit. You win by separating the insurgents from the population, destroying their supply networks, and making guerrilla operations logistically impossible. Arts and minds, yes, but backed by ruthlessly effective small unit operations that targeted the enemy's infrastructure, not his manpower. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition. The Australians were fighting a war of systems. And Major Smith had just said it out loud in a room full of officers whose careers depended on pretending the American approach worked. The shouting match lasted 10 minutes. 3 different colonels tried to explain to Smith why body counts were a valid metric. Smith responded with questions they couldn't answer. If body counts meant progress, why wasn't the war getting better? If attrition worked, why were enemy recruitment rates stable? If killing VC faster than they could replace them was the strategy, why were there more enemy in country now than in 1965? The general finally shut it down. He told Smith his observations were noted, and he could return to his task force. The tone suggested Smith should expect a diplomatic incident. Smith saluted and left. He expected to be reprimanded, maybe recalled to Australia. You didn't tell American generals their entire strategic framework was bullshit and walk away clean. Instead, something strange happened. 3 days later, a Pentagon analysis team showed up at Nui Dat. They wanted to observe Australian operations, understand the tactical differences, see what this different approach looked like in practice. The Australian task force commander, Brigadier Stuart Graham, was skeptical. He'd dealt with American observers before. They usually showed up, watched for a day, concluded that small-scale operations were fine for small allies, but America needed to think bigger, and left. But these analysts were different. They'd actually read the after-action reports. They'd noticed that Phuoc Twy's security indicators were trending opposite to everywhere else in 3 Corps. They wanted to know why. Graham assigned them to follow a rifle company on patrol. Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, commanded by Major Smith, the company that didn't count bodies. They came from suburbs and farms and coastal towns most Americans couldn't find on a map. Private Kevin Dasher Wheatley had been a jackaroo, a ranch hand, working cattle stations in rural New South Wales. Before the army, his world was dirt roads, stock horses, and fencing wire. He'd never left Australia, never seen combat, never fired a weapon at another human being. Corporal Barry Blue Mackenzie had shaped surfboards in Torquay, Victoria. His hands knew foam and resin, not rifle stocks and grenades. His biggest worry had been whether the surf would be good on the weekend. Private Jim Richmond had been a diesel mechanic's apprentice in suburban Brisbane. fixed trucks, drank beer with his mates, dated a girl named Sharon who worked at the chemist. 6 months of training turned them into something else. Not overnight, not through magic, through a specific, deliberate process that the Australian Army had refined over decades of jungle warfare. The training centered at Canungra, in the mountains behind the Gold Coast. Jungle Warfare School. 6 weeks that broke down everything you thought you knew about combat and rebuilt it for an environment where you couldn't see 50 meters, couldn't hear properly, and couldn't trust anything. They learned to move silently through vegetation so thick you had to feel your way forward. They learned to shoot accurately in 3-second windows when the jungle opened up enough to see a target. They learned to listen, really listen, because in the jungle, hearing an AK safety click off might be the only warning you got. But the real transformation wasn't physical, it was mental. They learned patience. American doctrine emphasized speed and violence of action. Get in, hit hard, get out. Overwhelming firepower, applied rapidly. It worked in conventional warfare. In the jungle, it got you killed. The Australians learned to wait, to watch, to spend 8 hours lying motionless observing a trail junction, to follow enemy tracks for 3 days without engaging, to ambush with such discipline that the first shot fired was the only shot needed. Dasher Wheatley, the jackaroo who tracked cattle, became a tracker who could follow VC spoor through jungle that Americans thought was impenetrable. He could read disturbed leaves, notice grass bent the wrong way, spot a footprint in mud that was 6 hours old. Blue Mackenzie, the surfboard shaper with artist's hands, became a scout who could move through the jungle like smoke. He learned to see patterns, the way vines hung, the way clearings formed, the 1,000 tiny signals that meant ambush ahead or bunker complex nearby. Jim Richmond, the mechanic, became a machine gunner who could field strip his M60 in darkness, clear a jam by touch, and lay down suppressing fire with such precision that his tracer rounds bracketed enemy positions without wasting ammunition. They weren't transformed into super soldiers. They were transformed into professionals who understood their environment and their enemy. The difference was everything. The Pentagon analysts followed Delta Company on a standard patrol, standard by Australian definition, which meant completely alien by American standards. The patrol left Nui Dat at 0400 hours, 38 men, light weapons, rifles, machine guns, grenades, claymores, no artillery support pre-planned, no helicopters on standby, no massive logistics tail, just the patrol and the jungle. The Americans expected a route patrol, predetermined course, check certain objectives, return by nightfall. Delta Company didn't patrol like that. They went where the intelligence indicated enemy presence. Sometimes that meant following a trail for 12 hours. Sometimes it meant sitting in an ambush position for 2 days waiting for a logistics courier who might not come. Sometimes it meant breaking into 4-man teams and working a grid square so thoroughly that every trail, every water source, every potential campsite got observed. The first day, they covered 3 kilometers. The Americans were confused. At that rate, you'd never cover your area of operations. Delta Company's sergeant just smiled. "We're not trying to cover ground, mate. We're trying to find Charlie." On the second day, they found sign, fresh tracks, 5 men moving north, probably a VC reconnaissance team. The Americans expected immediate pursuit, call in helicopters, set up a cordon, bring in more forces. Smith ordered the patrol to follow at a distance. Just track them. See where they went. The analysts were baffled. "You've got contact. Why aren't you engaging?" Smith looked at them like they'd suggested burning down the jungle to clear the vegetation. "Because 5 VC scouts aren't the target. Whatever they're scouting for is the target. And if we kill them, we'll never find it." They followed the VC team for 18 hours. The enemy wasn't even trying to hide their trail. They thought they were in safe territory. They led Delta Company straight to a way station hidden in a stream valley. Bunkers, supply cache, documents, radio equipment. Empty at the moment, but clearly in active use. Smith set up an ambush. Not on the way station itself, on the approach trails. Then they waited. 31 hours they waited. The Americans were losing their minds. You could call in an airstrike, destroy the facility right now, And tomorrow they'd build another one, Smith said. I want the people who use this one, the logistics officers, the political cadre, the ones who actually matter. Hour 32, the enemy came back, not the 5 scouts. A logistics team, 11 men. 3 of them, clearly officers based on their equipment. They walked straight into the ambush without knowing Delta Company had been lying 10 meters away for a day and a half. Smith let them get comfortable, let them set down their weapons, let them relax. Then he initiated. The firefight lasted 20 seconds. 11 enemy killed, no Australian casualties. The supply cache secured, the documents captured, and those documents identified 3 more way stations and named 17 VC political officers operating in Phuoc Tuy. Body count, 11. Strategic result, an entire logistics network compromised, and 3 weeks of follow-up operations that dismantled enemy infrastructure across 2 districts. One of the Pentagon analysts asked, "Why didn't you report the body count in your radio check?" The radio operator, a lance corporal from Adelaide who'd been a bank teller, looked genuinely confused. "Why would we? For the record, for confirmation of enemy losses. We'll put it in the after-action report if you want. But nobody here cares, mate. We got what we came for." The analyst wrote that down verbatim. The Australian approach wasn't soft. It was harder than the American approach. Harder in the sense of requiring more discipline, more patience, more professional skill. American units rotated men individually. Soldier did his 12 months, went home, got replaced. The unit was a shell that individuals passed through. Cohesion was temporary. Experience was constantly bleeding away. Australian units deployed together, fought together, went home together. Delta Company was Delta Company. Same faces, same section leaders, same accumulated knowledge. They learned from their mistakes and got better over time. American patrols were loud, radio chatter, mechanical noise, air support on call. The enemy could hear them coming from kilometers away. Australian patrols moved silent. No talking, no smoking, hand signals only. They became part of the jungle instead of intruders in it. American operations had time limits. Go out for 3 days, come back, rest. The tempo was predictable. Australian operations lasted as long as necessary. 5 days, 8 days, 12 days. They'd stay out until they accomplished the mission or got compromised. The VC couldn't predict their patterns because there were no patterns. American forces relied on firepower. If you made contact, you called in artillery, gunships, airstrikes. You smothered the enemy in explosives. Australian forces relied on fieldcraft. They avoided contact unless they could control it. When they did fight, they fought with such precision that the initial ambush often ended the engagement before the enemy could react. The differences weren't about courage. American soldiers were brave. Both forces had men who'd walk into machine gun fire to save a mate. The differences were philosophical. Americans treated Vietnam like a war you won by killing enough enemy. Australians treated it like a problem you solved by making enemy operations impossible. Americans measured success in bodies. Australians measured success in whether the enemy could still function afterward. And the results spoke for themselves. Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 had been completely insecure. The VC controlled everything except the district towns, and even those were iffy after dark. They taxed every village. They recruited openly. They moved supplies on the main roads. By 1969, the province was transformed. The VC had been pushed into the hills. Their logistics network was shattered. Villages that had paid VC taxes now paid government taxes. Roads that had been death traps for convoys were passable. The province capital, Baria, had markets that stayed open after sunset. The Australians had done this with 4,500 men. The Americans had 500,000 troops in country, and most provinces were getting worse. The Pentagon analysts noticed this. They noticed a lot of things. They noticed that Australian patrols made contact less frequently than American patrols, but had higher kill ratios when they did engage. They noticed that Australian operations generated less ammunition expenditure, but more intelligence. They noticed that pacified villages near Nui Dat stayed pacified villages near American bases reverted to VC control within weeks. They also noticed that Australian soldiers had completely different attitudes. American soldiers counted days. Days until rotation. Days until home. Short timer calendars. The war was something to survive, not to win. Australian soldiers talked about the mission, about the province, about whether they were actually achieving anything. They gave a shit, not in a rah-rah patriotic way, but in a professional craftsman way. They wanted to do the job properly. The analysts interviewed dozens of Australian soldiers. They asked about tactics, training, philosophy, everything. One interview became legendary. They asked Corporal Mackenzie, Blue, the former surfboard shaper, how he measured success on patrol. He thought about it for a minute. Then, if we go out for 8 days and kill 30 VC, but the villages are still hostile, and the trails are still active, we failed. If we go out for 8 days and kill 3 VC, but we find a cache and burn it, and the villages tell us where the VC are hiding, we won. It's not about the numbers, mate. It's about whether Charlie can still operate. The analysts asked what he thought about body counts. Waste of time. You know what happens when you chase body counts? You kill farmers. You kill random blokes because you need numbers for the report. You stop caring whether you're actually hurting the enemy and start caring whether you can claim you did. It's arse backwards. They asked a lieutenant, an engineering graduate from Sydney who'd been in country for 11 months, whether the Australian approach could scale. Scale to what? American force levels? He laughed. Mate, if you put 500,000 Australians in Vietnam using our tactics, the war would have been over in 1967. But that's not the point. The point is that small unit tactics focused on enemy infrastructure work better than massive sweeps focused on body counts. And you don't need 500,000 men to prove it. You just need professionals who understand counterinsurgency. Blunt, confident, completely unbothered by the fact that he was implying American strategy was fundamentally flawed. The analysts wrote it all down. The Pentagon team's report hit Saigon command like a grenade in a briefing room. It was diplomatic. It was professionally written. It bent over backwards to avoid criticizing American leadership directly, but the implications were devastating. The report noted that Australian operations achieved significantly higher strategic impact per casualty inflicted. It observed that Australian-controlled areas showed markedly better security indicators than comparable American-controlled areas. It suggested that alternative metrics beyond enemy casualties might provide better strategic assessment. In bureaucratic Pentagon language, this was equivalent to standing up and screaming that the entire American approach was wrong. 3 generals tried to bury the report. It was based on too small a sample size. It didn't account for different operational conditions. The Australians had a smaller area to secure. The comparisons weren't valid, but the numbers wouldn't go away. Someone leaked the report to journalists. Someone else leaked Australian after-action reports showing the actual tactical differences. A Stars and Stripes reporter embedded with an Australian unit and wrote a feature that asked uncomfortable questions about why allies with a fraction of American resources were achieving better results. The body count obsession started to crack. Not immediately, not completely. The system had too much inertia. Too many careers depended on the metrics staying relevant. Too much political capital had been invested in proving that high body counts meant progress. But cracks appeared. Some American units started adopting Australian tactics. Small-scale operations, emphasis on intelligence, longer patrols with less support, ambushes that waited for the right targets instead of engaging immediately. Some American commanders started questioning the body count reports, started asking what had actually been achieved beyond the numbers, started measuring success by whether the enemy could still operate. It was too little, too late for Vietnam. The war was already lost by 1969. Lost politically, lost strategically, lost in ways that tactical excellence couldn't fix. But the lessons stuck. Major Harry Smith never got in trouble for the briefing room confrontation. The expected diplomatic incident never materialized. His commander didn't reprimand him. The Americans didn't file a complaint. Instead, Smith got promoted, made lieutenant colonel, sent to train the next generation of Australian infantry officers. He spent the rest of his career teaching the same lessons. Don't count bodies. count results. Don't chase metrics, chase strategic impact. Don't fight the war your enemy wants you to fight. The Australian task force stayed in Vietnam until 1972. They left Phuoc Tuy Province, more secure than any other province in South Vietnam. They'd done it with 521 killed in action. Horrific losses, but a fraction of what equivalent American forces suffered for worse results. After they left, the province collapsed within months. The South Vietnamese forces couldn't maintain security. The VC came back. The infrastructure got rebuilt. By 1975, Phuoc Tuy fell to the North Vietnamese like everywhere else. The tragedy of it haunted the veterans. They'd done the job. They'd proven the concept. They'd shown that counterinsurgency could work when executed properly, and then the political will evaporated, and it all fell apart. But the lessons survived. The Pentagon team's observations about Australian tactics filtered through the American military for decades, not officially, not as formal doctrine changes, but through informal channels. Officers who'd observed Australian operations, soldiers who'd fought alongside them, the institutional memory of people who'd seen something work and wanted to understand why. When the American military rebuilt itself after Vietnam, some of those lessons got incorporated. Emphasis on small unit tactics, professional NCO corps with continuity, focus on intelligence-driven operations, metrics that measured strategic impact rather than just enemy casualties. When American Special Operations Forces developed Counter-Insurgency doctrine in the 1980s and 90s, they studied the Australian approach. The emphasis on population security over body counts, the patient, intelligence-focused operations, the understanding that you win guerrilla wars by making enemy operations impossible, not by killing more people than they can recruit. When the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan started, some American units remembered the lessons. They understood that sweeps that generated big body counts but left the enemy infrastructure intact accomplished nothing. That occupying ground meant staying, not hitting, and leaving. That measuring success required looking at whether the enemy could still function, not just whether you'd killed a lot of them. Not every unit learned. Not every commander understood. The body count mentality never fully died. It just evolved into different metrics that measured the wrong things. But some understood. The ones who understood were usually the ones who'd taken time to study how other countries fought. The British in Northern Ireland, the Australians in Vietnam, the counter-insurgency campaigns that actually worked. They understood what Major Smith had tried to explain in that briefing room in 1969. You're counting the wrong things. Dasher Wheatley, the jackaroo-turned-tracker, survived Vietnam. He went back to cattle stations. He didn't talk about the war much. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he'd gone on some long walks in unpleasant conditions, and leave it at that. He still moved quietly. He still read tracks in the dirt. Cattle tracks now, not VC trails. He still observed before acting. The jungle had changed him in ways that never fully wore off. Blue Mackenzie, the surfboard shaper turned scout, survived too. He went back to Torquay, back to foam and resin. But his hands remembered other things. He'd wake up sometimes at 3 a.m. and listen to the silence, still expecting to hear movement in the bush. He shaped boards for another 40 years. Never talked about being terrified. Never talked about the nights in ambush positions. Never mentioned that he'd learned to see in darkness and move through vegetation like a ghost. He did tell one story, late in life, to a nephew who asked about Vietnam. We had a different way of fighting. The Americans wanted big numbers, big sweeps, big body counts. We wanted results. And the thing about results is you can't fake them. Either the village is secure or it isn't. Either the enemy can operate or he can't. Either you've achieved something or you haven't. Numbers lie, results don't. Jim Richmond, the mechanic turned machine gunner, survived. He went back to Brisbane, back to diesel engines and beer with mates. Sharon had moved on, married someone else while he was deployed. He didn't blame her. He worked as a mechanic for 30 years. He was good at it, methodical, patient. He'd learned patience in the jungle, the kind of patience where you wait 2 days for the right moment and then act with absolute precision. He never counted the people he'd killed. Not once. He could have tallied it up. He remembered the firefights, remembered the ambushes, but counting seemed pointless. What mattered was whether he'd done his job, whether his section had survived, whether they'd achieved the mission. The rest was just numbers, and numbers don't tell you anything that matters. The quote became famous. Eventually, "We don't count bodies." It showed up in military history books, in Counter-Insurgency Doctrine, in staff college lectures. It became shorthand for a whole philosophy of warfare. Some people heard it as arrogance, Australian troops thumbing their noses at American allies, a small force claiming superiority over a superpower. They missed the point entirely. It wasn't arrogance, it was professionalism. A surgeon doesn't measure success by how many incisions they made. An engineer doesn't measure success by how many calculations they performed. A soldier shouldn't measure success by how many people they killed. You measure success by whether you achieved the strategic objective. In Vietnam, the strategic objective was defeating the insurgency, making communist takeover impossible, securing the population, destroying enemy infrastructure. Body counts measured none of those things. You could kill 50,000 VC and lose the war. You could kill 500 VC and win your province. The difference was whether you killed the right people, destroyed the right infrastructure, secured the right population centers, and maintained the right pressure over time. The Australians understood this. They'd learned it in Malaya, where British and Commonwealth forces had defeated a communist insurgency by patient, methodical operations that separated guerrillas from their support base. They'd learned it in Borneo, where small unit operations had prevented Indonesian infiltration. They'd learned it through decades of actual counterinsurgency experience. The Americans were learning it through failure. And Major Smith's 5 words crystallized the difference. The general who'd gotten angry in the briefing room, the 2-star who'd demanded to know how the Australians measured success, eventually understood. Not immediately, not in 1969. He was too invested in the system. Too much of his career had been built on proving that body counts mattered. But years later, after Vietnam fell, after the post-mortems began, after the hard questions got asked about why the world's most powerful military had lost to peasants in black pajamas, he read the Australian after-action reports. He saw the numbers, the actual numbers, not body counts but operational results. Australian forces, 521 killed in action. Phuoc Tuy Province secured to the point where refugee flows reversed. People were moving into the province because it was safer. VC infrastructure dismantled so thoroughly that enemy operations required external support. Villages providing intelligence voluntarily. Roads secure enough that military convoys became unnecessary. American forces, 58,000 killed in action. Most provinces still insecure. VC infrastructure functional. Villages still paying VC taxes. Enemy recruiting rates stable. The math was ugly. He wrote a letter to the Australian task force commander who'd replaced Brigadier Graham. He didn't apologize. Generals don't apologize. But he acknowledged that the Australians had demonstrated tactical and strategic competence worthy of study. In Pentagon language, that was practically a confession. The commander wrote back. Short letter. Professional. We counted what mattered. Perhaps you should have too. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was just truth. The men who didn't count bodies came home to a country that didn't much care what they'd done. Australia's involvement in Vietnam was unpopular. The protests, the draft dodgers, the anger at American policy that Australia had supported. The veterans came back to a nation that wanted to forget the war, not celebrate it. So they didn't talk much about what they'd achieved. They didn't tell people about the patrols that lasted 2 weeks, about the ambushes executed with such precision that the enemy died without firing a shot, about the villages they'd secured, about the tactical excellence they'd demonstrated. They just went back to civilian life. They became teachers, tradesmen, office workers, farmers. They raised families. They dealt with nightmares and survivor's guilt and the specific trauma of having done everything right and watched it all collapse anyway. But among themselves, they knew. They knew they'd fought a different war than the Americans. They knew they'd done it better. They knew that the province they'd secured had been genuinely secure, not fake metric secure, but actually safe. They knew that when a Pentagon general had demanded to know how they measured success, they'd given the only answer that mattered. We don't count bodies, we count results. And the results had been there, clear, undeniable. until the political will evaporated and Phuoc Tuy fell with the rest of South Vietnam. That was the tragedy. Not that they'd failed. They hadn't failed. They'd succeeded at everything they'd been asked to do. The tragedy was that success at the tactical level couldn't compensate for strategic failure. That you could secure a province perfectly and it still wouldn't matter if the war was being lost everywhere else. But the lessons survived. Decades later, military historians studying Vietnam came back to the Australian operations again and again. They were the case study that worked, the proof that counterinsurgency could succeed when executed properly. The evidence that the problem wasn't the concept, but the implementation. The Australians had demonstrated that you could secure a population, that you could dismantle an insurgency, that you could win a guerrilla war against a determined enemy. You just couldn't do it by counting bodies. You had to count whether villages were secure, whether enemy logistics were disrupted, whether political cadres were eliminated, whether the population was turning against the insurgents, whether enemy operations were becoming impossible. Those things couldn't be measured in a spreadsheet. They couldn't be graphed. They couldn't be presented to Congress as proof of progress, but they were real. And when you focused on real strategic impact instead of fake metrics, you got real results. The American military eventually learned this. It took decades. It took more failed wars and more hard lessons and more after-action reports asking why small allied forces had achieved better results with fewer resources. But they learned. Modern American counterinsurgency doctrine emphasizes population security over enemy casualties, intelligence-driven operations over sweeps, strategic impact over body counts. It's Australian doctrine filtered through painful experience. Major Smith's 5 words had been vindicated. Harry Smith died in 2020. COVID got him, the virus that didn't care about tactical excellence or strategic brilliance, or whether you'd been right about counterinsurgency doctrine 50 years earlier. His obituaries mentioned Long Tan. They mentioned his decorations. They mentioned his command of Delta Company. Some of them mentioned the briefing room confrontation, the moment when an Australian major told a Pentagon general that they were counting the wrong things. The veterans who'd served under him remembered something else. They remembered a commander who cared whether the mission accomplished something real, who wouldn't waste lives on operations that just generated numbers for reports, who understood that soldiers weren't chess pieces to be traded for metrics, but professionals whose lives had value beyond what they contributed to a spreadsheet. They remembered patrols that had purpose, operations that achieved strategic impact, a commander who measured success by whether the enemy could still function, not by how many bodies they'd counted. They remembered the discipline of waiting 2 days for the right target, instead of engaging immediately for a quick body count. The professionalism of treating warfare as a problem to solve rather than a contest to win through attrition. They remembered coming home alive because their commander had refused to waste them on pointless operations that looked good on paper but accomplished nothing. That was his legacy, not the body counts he didn't produce, the results he did. We're still learning the lesson. Every few years, some conflict emerges where someone decides that body counts are a good metric again, that you can measure progress by how many enemy you kill. That attrition works if you just apply it hard enough. And every time, it fails. Because you can't win guerrilla wars by counting bodies. You can't defeat insurgencies by killing more people than they recruit. You can't achieve strategic objectives by focusing on tactical metrics that measure activity instead of impact. The Australians knew this in 1966. They tried to teach it. Some people learned, most didn't. The ones who learned understood that warfare is about achieving strategic objectives, not satisfying statistical requirements. That the question isn't how many did we kill, but can the enemy still function? That success means accomplishing the mission, not generating impressive numbers. The ones who didn't learn kept chasing body counts under different names. Enemy casualties, insurgents eliminated, terrorists neutralized. The language changed, but the obsession with numbers stayed the same, and the results stayed the same too. Tactical victories that accomplished nothing strategically. Operations that generated big numbers but changed nothing on the ground. Wars that dragged on for years because no one asked whether killing more people actually moved toward the strategic objective. The Australian approach wasn't complicated. It was just hard. Hard because it required patience. Hard because it required professional skill. Hard because it required measuring things that couldn't be easily quantified. Hard because it required admitting that what looks good on paper might accomplish nothing in reality. Hard because it required saying no to the easy metrics and yes to the difficult questions. Hard because it required officers willing to stand in briefing rooms and tell generals they were counting the wrong things. 5 words: we don't count bodies. Not a boast, not an insult, just a statement of tactical philosophy. The Australians counted results. They counted whether villages were secure. They counted whether enemy operations were disrupted. They counted whether the strategic objective was being achieved. Body counts were incidental. If killing people advanced the strategic objective, fine. If it didn't, then you were just wasting ammunition and making the wrong enemy. This should have been obvious. In any other profession, it would be obvious you don't measure a doctor's success by how many procedures they performed. You don't measure an engineer's success by how many calculations they made. You measure success by whether they achieved the objective. But in Vietnam, the American military forgot this. They became obsessed with a metric that measured activity instead of impact. They counted the wrong things and wondered why the numbers kept going up, while the war kept getting worse. The Australians remembered. They kept their eyes on what mattered. They measured success by whether they were winning, not by how many people they'd killed while trying to win. And in their province, for the years they were there, they won. Not forever, not in a way that survived their departure, but genuinely, measurably, undeniably won. The villages were secure. The enemy couldn't operate. The infrastructure was destroyed. The population was turning against the insurgents. Those were the things that mattered. Those were the things worth counting. Everything else was just numbers, and numbers lie. Results don't.